In his new book, A Voyage Without My Father, author and coach Dexter Moscow seeks to help people who've experienced the death or loss of a parent when they were young. His mission is to highlight the way it can adversely affect their entire lives if it's left unprocessed, and he also offers strategies for overcoming its debilitating grip. Thanks for joining us on today's show, Dexter.
My pleasure. It's lovely to be with you.
So can I ask, this book is for men in particular, I believe?
Yes, I've said that because it is men that don't talk about this. Often women have a network, they're meeting. At one time they used to meet people at the school gates. And now, obviously, that's a little bit more difficult, but men really are closed-mouthed about it, whether they're frightened of showing their emotions or perhaps don't even realize that they have a problem.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think men need to know that vulnerability is not a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of strength, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the more we talk about this, and we're being led now by the princes, specifically the prince who is speaking to footballers who are seen as very macho, who are now prepared to talk about this vulnerability. And it is, as you rightly say, vulnerability is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength.
So you relate to your own personal experience. I believe you were only 10 when your father died.
Yes, he was only 45, and so he was taken very young. And it was at a time when kids were not allowed on hospital wards. So to my continuing regret, I never got to say goodbye to my dad. And one of the reasons I'm publishing the book now is because so many people have had this same experience with COVID. They weren't there to hold the hands of their loved ones as they passed. And unfortunately, it was the burden of the doctors and the nurses. And so, as with me, it only really impacted me much later in life. And I think that this is a mental health issue that's going to impact a lot of people with guilt, regret, sometimes with anger, because those are the different stages of grief.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be very impactful.
And I suppose, I have no idea how old you are, but even if we were talking 10, 20 years ago, like we say, it's changed. The mental health issues, people talking about them, famous people talking about them, has changed. But back then, did you think you couldn't cry, you couldn't grieve because you were a boy, not a girl?
No, I think that it was deeper than that. I think that I didn't know how to process it. Obviously, I knew that when my uncle came to me and said, I'm afraid, Dex, your dad is gone. My immediate reaction was, gone where? And so it was only then that I started to process the fact that, he was not there anymore. But later in life, these very significant points, and again, we've seen it with the princes, that, 30-odd years since their mum has passed, it is only now that they're starting to talk about it. And, it's that kind of thing that comes back to you when you have children, when you get married, or you have grandchildren, which I'm delighted to say I have. But it's those times that sublimated feeling comes back and you realize how impactful the loss of that parent has been.
And how should one process it then, Dexter? Is it about talking about it? Is it about the whole family discussing it?
Yes, I think it is. Or to find somebody who is separate, because obviously family gets very emotional. I went through what I call my voyage of discovery, because at the age of 42, and certainly at the age of 45, when my dad passed at that age, I found that I was reacting to things unreasonably. I got angry at the little things, and I lost my temper, and I didn't fully understand it. So I sat down with my wife, Fran, and I said, something is not right here. What should I do? So I went into psychotherapy, and for 18 months, it was a lot of help out of those kind of talking therapies. But what I realized and what came out of those conversations was that I was angry with my dad. But what can you do? What can you do about that? I couldn't have a conversation with him. Or could I? And that's what led me to find these other therapies. And that I've illustrated them as in an acronym called MIC, M-I-C. So I found meditation. I found imagination, so that I can imagine that I could go back and have this conversation with him. And therefore the third element is the C, communication, which was partly what they call Gestalt therapy, where you go back in your imagination at a meditative level and you have that conversation. And I did. I spoke to my dad and I said, why did you leave us? You knew that chain smoking was wrong. You knew that you were overweight. How could you leave us? And through Gestalt, you kind of had that same conversation in your head, but taking both parts of the conversation. And we, in my imagination, hugged, cried, but then I came out of that feeling elated, and that as if a burden had been removed from my shoulders. So that's what I want to do in the book. I want to give people, yes, my story, and some of it is very funny, some of it is obviously sad, and the impact of lyrics of a song is very, very key to start understanding our emotions. But it is those therapies that I found, or perhaps they found me, that really helped me through. And that's what I want to illustrate, that there is a way through. You can overcome loss. You'll never sublimate the pain completely, because that loss is physical in some cases. But also we should never forget those loved ones. We should remember the good times, remember those happy incidents, even though for me they were very few and far between. But I still talk to him, and I find that very releasing, and that's one of my key messages for people. Don't think you can't still have those conversations.
Yeah, I suppose in asking the questions, now that you're older and wiser yourself, like you say, you can answer those questions yourself by asking them. You know that he didn't mean to leave you. You know that he was a smoker, and that was how he was. So you're answering your own questions through your father, I suppose.
Yes, and, you know, it is a terrible thing, the loss of a parent, the loss of anybody. But there are lessons to be learnt from it, and I think that it made me the person that I am, that I spent much more time with my sons, because one never knows, and as we know in this present situation, life can be very frail. So, you know, that's part of the message, to live the life as they would want us to live the life, not to live a life of grief and regret and guilt, but to find ways that we can have those releasing conversations so that we can move forward, never forget them, always remember the good times, but then live our life as they would want and as we would want.
Yeah, very, very good advice. And I was reading that the book is more in the style of a movie than a book. Instead of chapter to chapter, it's scene to scene, and you've got all the cast members, etc. It sounds like a great idea to help people.
Well, I hope so. I wanted it to be in narrative form. I wanted it to tell the stories. And the reason I've called them scenes, because life is like a movie, you know, that everything is, when we see a disaster movie, everything is light and lovely, and we get to know the people, and it's a wonderful feeling. And then disaster strikes. And then we recognize the people and what they're going through. But then it's the end of the movie when there is a resolution, where we see the survivors, we see how they've coped, we've seen the strategies that they go through to be able to carry on and live their life after the tragedy. And so that's how I see it. That's how I see a movie.
Yeah, sounds like it's going to be a great help to a lot of people. It's called A Voyage Without My Father by Dexter Moscow, who we're speaking to now. Is it out now, Dexter?
No, there are a couple of other elements that I'm going through. In truth, I've quoted a number of song titles and song lyrics in the book, and obviously I need clearance on that. Also, there are certain photographs I want to add. So it certainly is in an evaluation state. It will be published sometime towards the beginning to end of August.
Lovely.
So that's when it will be available.
We'll look out for it. Thank you very much for being on the show today.
My pleasure. Lovely to speak to you.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Bye-bye.